My manager called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in early March, and the smirk on his face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. "Olivia," he said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of confidence that only comes from people who have never once questioned whether they deserve it, "we've been reviewing the team structure, and we've made a decision. Your role is being outsourced to a third-party consulting firm starting next month. We'll need you to spend the next 3 weeks doing a full handover to the incoming consultant." He slid a folder across the desk. "Sign here, acknowledging you've been informed." I looked at the folder. I looked at him. And then I did something that clearly confused him. I smiled. "Of course," I said. "I'll make sure the transition is seamless." He blinked. He had expected tears, maybe anger, maybe the kind of desperate negotiating that makes managers feel powerful. What he did not expect was calm. What he absolutely did not know, what no one in that building knew except my lawyer and my accountant, was that 4 months earlier, I had quietly acquired a controlling stake in the parent company that owned the very firm he thought he was running. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. My name is Olivia Reyes, and I was 29 years old when all of this happened. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes assume a story like this belongs to someone older, someone with decades of gray hair and a corner office. But I had been working at Hartwell Creative Group since I was 22, straight out of my marketing degree at the University of Toronto. 7 years. I had given that company 7 years of early mornings and late nights and weekends. I told myself I'd get back someday. Hartwell was a mid-sized brand strategy firm based in downtown Toronto, the kind of place that punched above its weight with a handful of major retail and hospitality clients across Canada. When I joined, it was still being run by its founder, a man named Gerald Hartwell, who had built the whole thing from a 2-person consultancy out of a shared office space in Kensington Market back in the 90s. Gerald was the kind of boss who remembered your birthday, asked about your parents, and pushed you harder than you thought you could go, not because he wanted to extract value from you, but because he genuinely believed you were capable of more than you knew. I started as a junior account coordinator. By 25, I was managing my own client portfolio. By 27, I was head of brand partnerships, overseeing a team of 6, and responsible for roughly 40% of the company's recurring revenue. I wasn't just good at my job. I was the job. In a lot of ways. The systems I built, the client relationships I maintained, the processes I documented, those were the bones of how Hartwell's partnership division operated. Gerald knew it. He told me once, during a late Friday afternoon debrief when the office had mostly emptied out, that he was grooming me for a senior leadership role. He said it plainly. The way he said everything, no fanfare, just fact. "You're going to run something important one day, Olivia. Probably this." He gestured vaguely at the walls around us. I laughed it off the way you do when someone says something that you want to be true so badly that you're afraid to believe it. Then, Gerald had a stroke in October of my 7th year, and everything changed. He survived, thankfully, but his recovery was slow, and the doctors were clear that a return to the pressures of running a company was not in the cards. Gerald had 2 adult children, both of them living in Vancouver with no interest in the business. His wife had passed years earlier. So with no obvious succession plan in place, the board, which had always been a quiet, rubber stamp kind of board, suddenly found itself having to make real decisions. They brought in Marcus Delacroix. Marcus came from a private equity background in Montreal. He was 44, polished in the way that consulting firms manufacture, polish, and he arrived with a mandate from the board to modernize operations and improve margin efficiency. That was the language they used. What it meant in practice was that Marcus showed up in early January, took one look at the company Gerald had spent 30 years building, and immediately began identifying what he could cut. He didn't ask questions. He didn't spend time understanding why things worked the way they did. He scheduled back-to-back 30-minute meetings with each department head in his first week, and I would later find out from a colleague that he had already prepared his restructuring plan before those meetings even happened. The conversations were theater. His decisions were already made. I remember my meeting with him clearly. He asked me to walk him through the partnerships division, and I did. I gave him the full picture. the client relationships, the pipeline, the renewal rates, how we structured our service agreements, why certain clients needed hands-on management versus those who could be handled more efficiently. I was thorough. I was proud of what we had built and I wanted him to understand it. He nodded through the whole thing, typed occasionally on his laptop. When I finished, he said, "Great, thanks for that," and moved on to his next question, which was about headcount costs. I knew then that he hadn't heard a word I said. Over the following weeks, Marcus began making changes. He replaced our head of finance with someone he had worked with in Montreal, a man named Thierry, who spent most of his first month asking questions that suggested he had never worked with a service-based business before. He restructured the client services team in ways that broke workflows that had taken years to develop. He canceled a quarterly client appreciation event that had been running for over a decade and was, based on every piece of feedback we had, one of the primary reasons our renewal rate was consistently above 90%. When I raised concerns carefully, professionally, with data, Marcus would listen with the surface patience of someone who has already decided you are a problem to be managed rather than a voice to be heard. He would say things like, "I appreciate you sharing that perspective," and then do exactly what he had planned to do anyway. I watched good people start to leave. A senior designer who had been with Hartwell for 9 years. Our client services manager, who had relationships with half a dozen of our biggest accounts. An account director who had personally closed 3 of our top 10 revenue contracts in the past 2 years. Each departure chipped away at something that I was watching Marcus fail to understand. He was destroying the institutional knowledge, the trust, the human infrastructure that made everything else possible. I stayed. Partly because I still believed in what Hartwell could be. Partly because of Gerald, who was recovering slowly at home, and who I visited every few weeks, bringing him updates on the company he had spent his life building. Those visits were harder as the months went on. I tried to be honest without being cruel. Gerald was sharp enough to read between the lines. "He doesn't understand what he has," Gerald said to me one afternoon, sitting in the sunroom of his house in Rosedale, a cup of tea going cold on the table beside him. He wasn't angry when he said it. He sounded tired. "No," I said. "He doesn't." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know the board is talking about selling." I didn't know that, but I wasn't entirely surprised. "The numbers are down," he said, 3 quarters in a row now. Marcus is telling them it's a transitional dip, that the restructuring will pay off, but a couple of them are nervous. There's been some quiet outreach from acquisition-minded parties. I drove home that evening thinking about what he had said. I was 29 years old. I had spent 7 years building something inside that company. I had watched the last 8 months systematically undo the things that made it worth building. And now there was the possibility that it would be sold off to whoever came along with the right number at the right time. I called my friend Priya that night. Priya was a corporate lawyer in the same year as me at U of T, and over the years she had become not just one of my closest friends but someone I trusted completely with serious things. I told her what Gerald had said. I told her I was thinking about something that probably sounded crazy. "How crazy?" she said. "Buying in," I said. "Acquiring a stake. Enough to have real influence." There was a pause. "Okay," she said, in the measured tone she used when she was already mentally pulling up the relevant legislation. "Tell me more." I had some savings, not a huge amount, but I had been careful with money since my early 20s, had invested consistently, had no debt outside of a manageable mortgage on a small condo in the East End. It wasn't enough on its own, but over the following weeks, with Priya's help, I began to piece together a structure. I spoke to a financial advisor. I had quiet, careful conversations with 2 former Hartwell clients who had left when the service quality dropped and who had expressed privately to me that they missed working with the old team. One of them, a retail executive named Douglas, who had been a Hartwell client for 11 years, was interested in more than just a service relationship. The process took about 3 months. There were documents and due diligence and more conversations with Priya than I can count, often late at night over takeout at her kitchen table. I learned more about corporate structure in those 3 months than I had in 7 years of working inside one. The board, it turned out, was more motivated to sell than Gerald had let on. 2 of the 5 members were quietly pushing for it, and the offer I structured, put together with Douglas as a co-investor and another private individual Priya connected me with, was serious enough to get traction. We closed in early November, quietly, the way these things are done when discretion matters. I owned a controlling stake in Hartwell Creative Group. My name was not on any of the public-facing documentation. My role at the company remained exactly what it had been the day before, and Marcus had absolutely no idea. I want to say I had some grand plan in those first few weeks after closing, but honestly, I was mostly watching. I needed to understand the full extent of what had happened to the company's finances, its client relationships, its internal structure. What I found, as I worked through the reports that now came to me through proper channels, was worse than I had suspected from the inside. 3 of our top 5 clients were in various stages of considering non-renewal. The company's operating costs had actually increased despite the restructuring, largely because the talent Marcus had lost needed to be replaced with contractors who cost more and delivered less. The culture, which had always been one of Hartwell's genuine strengths, was in pieces. Exit interview data, which Marcus apparently never read, was a fairly consistent document of damage. I kept going to work every day. I kept managing my team, maintaining my client relationships, doing my job with the same care I always had. I was cordial to Marcus in meetings. I did not give him any reason to look at me differently. In February, Marcus called me into his office and told me my position was being outsourced. His exact words were that the partnership's function was being restructured to improve cost efficiency and that an external consulting firm would be taking over client relationship management. He needed me to spend 3 weeks doing a complete handover to the incoming consultant, a woman who would be joining from the agency Marcus had contracted. He slid the folder across the desk. He had the smirk. He had the chair leaning back. He had absolutely no idea. "Of course," I said. "I'll make sure the transition is seamless." I spent that evening on the phone with Priya. We had already discussed the timeline for the changes I intended to make at the board level. Marcus's decision to outsource the partnership's function, the most revenue-critical function in the company, had accelerated things somewhat. We agreed that waiting out my 3-week handover period was not necessary. I made 2 phone calls the following morning, before I went into the office. One to Douglas. One to the company's board chair, a man named Richard who had been on the board since Gerald's early days, and who, based on everything I knew, had real reservations about the direction Marcus had taken. "I'd like to call a board meeting," I told Richard. "There are some things the board needs to hear and some decisions that need to be made. This week, if possible." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Is this about the operational direction?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Among other things." "I'll make some calls," he said. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I arrived early, which I always do. The boardroom at Hartwell was on the 14th floor, with a view across to the lake, and on a clear February afternoon, the light in that room is something low and gold and sharp through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had sat in that room dozens of times for client presentations, for strategy sessions, for the kind of meetings where the outcome was never really in doubt. This one was different. The board members filed in. Richard, 2 others, the 2 who had pushed for the sale. And then Marcus, who walked in mid-conversation with Thierry, glanced around the room, saw me, and registered a flicker of something surprise, maybe, that I was there. I was not typically part of board meetings. He sat down across from me and gave me the professionally neutral look of someone who has already decided how to manage you. Richard opened the meeting by introducing the agenda items. He mentioned that there were some structural updates to discuss, and that a significant shareholder wished to present some information to the board. Marcus's eyes moved around the table. "What shareholder?" Richard looked at me. "Me," I said. The silence in the room had texture to it. I had prepared for this moment carefully, not for drama, but for clarity. I had worked with Priya to put together a presentation that laid out, in plain and documented terms, what had happened to the company over the past 13 months since Marcus had taken over. the client retention numbers, the talent attrition, the operating cost trajectory, the revenue forecast if current trends continued. And then, alongside those numbers, a restructuring plan. My restructuring plan, with specific steps to stabilize the client base, rebuild the partnerships division, and address the cultural damage. I walked them through it methodically. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform anything. I had learned, somewhere in those 7 years of building things and watching them work, that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people is simply know more than anyone else and let the facts do the work. Marcus tried to interject twice. The first time I acknowledged his point and redirected. The second time Richard held up a hand. By the end of the presentation, the room was very quiet. The two board members who had pushed for the sale were looking at the numbers in front of them with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to something else. Richard asked several thoughtful questions. I answered them. And then the board voted to remove Marcus Delacroix as CEO of Hartwell Creative Group. He left the meeting without speaking to me. I heard later from someone who had been in the elevator with him that he looked like a man who was trying to understand how a floor he had been standing on had simply ceased to exist beneath him. I spent the rest of that day and the next 2 weeks in intensive conversations with clients, with remaining staff, with the contractors Marcus had brought in, with the few key people who had left and whom I wanted to reach out to about returning. Those conversations were hard and honest and necessary. I did not pretend that the past year hadn't happened. I did not make promises I couldn't keep. I told people what I had found, what I intended to do, and I asked for the chance to show them. Most of them gave it to me. The incoming consultant Marcus had hired to replace me, the one I was supposed to spend 3 weeks training, received a very different onboarding call than she had been expecting. I explained that the outsourcing arrangement was being canceled, that the partnership's role was not only staying in-house but was being expanded, and that if she was interested, there might be a different kind of opportunity at the company for someone with her background. She was, understandably, a bit thrown, but she was gracious about it, and we ended up having a genuinely good conversation. It took about 18 months to properly stabilize Hartwell. Some of it was hard. We lost one major client who had simply moved on too far to come back, and I had to make a couple of difficult decisions about personnel that I didn't enjoy making. But the renewal rate climbed back. New client signings picked up in the second half of that year. 3 of the people who had left under Marcus came back, including the senior designer and the account director who had closed those major contracts. Gerald came to visit the office for the first time since his stroke, about 14 months after the board meeting. He moved slower than he used to, and he tired more easily, but his eyes were sharp, and he spent 2 hours walking through the space, talking to people, asking questions. When we sat down together in the afternoon, he was quiet for a while. "You fixed it," he said. "We're fixing it," I said. "It takes time." He nodded. He looked out the window at the lake in the distance. "I should have had a better plan," he said, "for when I couldn't be here." "You couldn't have predicted everything," I said. "No," he said, "but I could have made sure the right people knew what they were protecting." He looked at me. "You knew." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. About what it means to truly understand the value of something, not just its revenue figures or its market position, but the human architecture underneath. The relationships built across years, the trust earned through consistent follow-through, the culture that makes good people want to stay and do their best work. Those things don't show up on a quarterly report until they're already gone. Marcus had never asked why things worked. He had only asked how much they cost. I've thought a lot about what I would say to someone in the position I was in, watching something you've helped build get taken apart by someone who doesn't understand it, feeling powerless, wondering whether the right thing to do is fight or leave. I don't think there's a single right answer to that. Sometimes leaving is the right call. Sometimes the damage is too far gone, and the most honest thing you can do for yourself is walk away. But if you stay, stay with intention. Know what you're protecting and why. Build the knowledge, build the relationships, build the skills, not as tools for some future moment of revenge, but because that's what doing good work actually looks like. The position I was in, when everything came to a head, existed because of 7 years of showing up properly. Not perfectly, but honestly, and with care. The most important thing I learned through all of this, and I mean this not as a tidy lesson but as something I understood down to my bones, is that real authority is not about your title. It is not about your office or your salary or whether your name is on the organizational chart in the right place. Real authority comes from understanding, from relationships, from the respect of people who have watched you do difficult things well over time. Marcus had all the formal power in the world for those 13 months. And it meant almost nothing in that boardroom, because he had not done the work to make it real. Titles can be given and taken. Competence, integrity, and genuine care for the people and work around you, those are things no one can outsource. Build those. Protect those. And when the moment comes, and in one way or another, it always comes, you will not need to raise your voice.